welcome everybody to the podcast From Therapy to Social Change. And I'm very pleased, and it's a real honor to welcome David Weaver to the podcast. So, David, thank you for joining us for the next hour or so to, dig into the conversation, and really pleased to have you here. I wanted to just begin by reading a bit of your bio, David, just to give listeners a sense of the breadth and the depth of your work over the years. Is that okay with you, David?
That's absolutely
That'd be lovely. Thank you. So, David, you're a former social worker, a senior manager within local government, university lecturer, and political advisor to two senior government ministers. A lot of your work has centered on leadership, change management, and conflict management. And you're also involved in facilitating leadership development programs, coaching, and interventions with senior leaders and key personnel within public service bodies, and as a senior partner of the DWC Consulting Group, doing a lot of work with leadership and change management consultancy. You've also are one of a small number of consultants involved in facilitating the leadership program for leading elected members, commissioned by the Local Government Association for England and Wales, developed a strong track record and reputation in the areas of coaching, mediation, and conflict management, where you've been consistently assisting individuals and organizations to arrive at effective outcomes, often where the contexts are regarded as sticky and highly complex. And you've also served a 5-year term as the president of the BACP, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. And your tenure finished just in 2022, so it's not that long ago. So that really is a breadth and a depth of work. And I'm sure as president of BACP, you've been in many sticky and delicate situations. It's probably a great way of describing the whole therapy field, I guess. So thank you for coming along to chat to us about therapy, social change, and even whether those two things can be connected. I think it's easy in the therapy field to think, oh, because we work so hard to understand people and to help affect change, I guess, whether we can at that wider cultural, societal context, whether we can be contributing to change. But I know in the couple of discussions we've had about the podcast, you've also been saying something about your own personal experiences. In the different places that you've lived, educational experiences, work experiences. Could you say a little bit about why you're so passionate about social change in
sure.
terms of your own experience, David?
Yeah,
Would that be okay?
sure. I suppose it's just defined me from the day I was born. And I remember at the age of 12, my best friend Glenn, he was a white boy. He was about 14 years of age, white boy. He said to me, Weaver, why is it that everything you talk about, everything you're experiencing, all your insights got something to do with the color of your skin? Actually, I was older than that, so it would be, something happens and I would relate it to being black. Or we go into a shop and I'd be thinking, they're looking at me because I'm black. Or the first time the two of us encountered the police, they picked on me and didn't pick on him. And I think for him, it was actually, he just navigated just being a normal boy. And as I grew older, I could see it now. You just occupy that central point of, what are you doing today? I'm going to pub later after work. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And I'm talking about going to certain meetings. I'm talking about watching the news and what it means for me or people like me and so forth. So from a very early age, and I had a father who was, he was a church minister. the largest church in Nottingham as I was growing up. And he also worked for local government. And we had, councillors, political councillors and MPs and so forth coming through the room, going into church and so forth. I remembered learning about my ancestry. And I've just felt that I can't occupy life without trying to do something to address the circumstances that people like me find themselves in based on the color of their skin, but also just people who are disadvantaged and discriminated against because of their identity, their class, their gender, sexuality, etc., etc. So there's always been that feeling of social justice that I've had, and I think that defines me really. It's about trying to do the best that I can to address the ills that I see within society. I wanted to be a footballer for a while, and I got through to Notts County, and but that wasn't good enough. I got caught smoking by Jimmy Sill, so that gave me clarity that this is what I need to do.
Okay, that was the end of that path, I guess. And yes, yeah. Thank you for that, David. Really appreciate it. And you, just before we started recording the podcast, you were relating an experience, I guess, when you were younger at school about the teacher wanting the class to be thinking about ancestry and like the
Yeah.
Could you say something about that,
That's
David,
right.
for
That's
us?
right. So it's something that's always asked of me, and a lot of black men, black women, which is around where does identity play a part? And from a very early age, I just remember being given homework, and my friend Glenn again and others about your family tree. So you have to go back and establish where you came from, your family tree, and so forth. And I remember going home and trying to do it, and just didn't get very far for all the reasons that we would know. I'll explain it in detail if it helps. Coming back to school, and my white friends were able to go way back, way back, way back, and I wasn't. But the key thing there was that there was no understanding, empathy, and if there was understanding, there was no empathy or awareness about why David Weaver couldn't do the homework in the same way as my white counterparts at that very young early age. And so from a very early age, you're being told that you're different, and you're seen. So you're having to understand what defines you, what describes you. I was talking earlier about my name, and I'm Weaver, and I'm very proud to be a Weaver, but that's not my name. You go back in history. Plantation owners in Antigua, there was a plantation owner called Weber, and my great-great-grandfather changed the name from Weber to Weaver in denouncing slavery. So, no matter how hard I tried as a young boy, as a man, to occupy that center of, it's normal. Let me just go on and be the same, be able to achieve and so forth. It wasn't the same.
Yeah. Well, and that teacher wasn't approaching the class thinking about the different ways that homework would impact everybody in the class. Like there's that assumption that, well, I think you even said the teacher's like, well, why haven't you done the homework properly, David? That kind of, yeah.
But it still happens now, doesn't it? And it probably isn't as blatant as that now, but it still happens now. If you look at the syllabus, is not truly multicultural or recognizing the ethnicities that there are. You could take away the issue of race and look at issues of class, look at issues of gender and so forth. It is not fully representative of those issues. So when you fast forward or look at some of the issues around training within therapy, look at the understanding that therapists have as a whole, as a system, in terms of the diversity of our society, the point that I'm making replicates, I would say, the counselling and psychotherapy world. And I felt that writ large, in my involvement, not just as president, but also as a board member and prior to that, as a vice president of the ACP, and certainly the work we do within communities. And so I feel that there is that real conversation to be had, for the meaningful outwards focused conversation to be had about what I see as the dissonance between the training that counsellors receive and the overall knowledge base and experience and skills on a systems level, because they're outstanding individuals within that dissonance between that and ordinary people in society. And I'm not just talking about race, although race is a key factor because of obviously the conversation that we've been having about my background.
Yeah. Yeah, because like you're saying, really, that's only a couple of 100 years ago. Like in history, that's not, in terms of what was happening to your family, in terms of name change, being displaced, and then being in this kind of culture. And yeah, but just no thought about that from the educational system that you were then growing up in.
Yes, yes. And I would say that, we talked about education. We spoke about some of my experiences as a child within that. This is where the conversation, I think, about institutional racism or institutional discrimination comes in. It's right across the board. And then the question needs to be asked, what does that mean then if we're speaking about therapy, counseling, psychotherapy, counseling professions? What does that mean then for the role of counseling and psychotherapy in terms of addressing those societal ills? And that's where that social change and social justice piece has been so important to me. And that's why I became interested in counseling and psychotherapy, actually, because I just felt it is so powerful, it can make a difference. But, it's not making a difference in the way, I will say these things, just opening and maybe provocatively, in the way that it could and the way that it should. And that is not to say there's not brilliant thinking that's taking place and brilliant interventions and so forth. Of course there are. But if we're dealing with social change as a system and see that counseling saves lives and can change lives, well, what is it that needs to happen within the profession? So we're talking about social change. What are the individual responsibilities of people that go into the profession? Should there be, a bit more clearly explained values? And I think we had this conversation many years ago, Mick, at a conference. I think we probably had a couple of glasses of wine and so forth. It was a good conversation. But what is it all about? And how do we ensure that these conversations are seen as business critical, embedded, and mainstream to conversations about not just the role of counselling and psychotherapy, but the nature of the training and the various disciplines and approaches to therapy and so forth, and their relevance for a diverse society. And I'm not just talking about race here, I'm talking about it across the board here.
Yes, yes. And if you were to talk frankly with us, David, I mean, it's only the three of us here, isn't there, for now, I suppose. But like as being on the board and then serving as president, like could you, because I mean, this is a big thing in therapy, isn't it? We need to know ourselves and know the discrepancy. Could you say something about the gap between what is needed and actually how you found the profession?
Yeah.
Like if you were to speak honestly with us.
Yeah. And before I say this, my mother, who passed 2 years ago, always used to say, when you point a finger there are 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. So I think that being part of it, I had a responsibility as well.
Right.
So I preface what I'm about to say by saying that. The more I engaged with the ACP and the profession, was the more I realized the absolute imperative nature of the profession, especially as I navigated both that profession and politics, and just felt that there is a real gap between when we talk about social change, politics, and the profession. And I think the twain isn't meeting. I think that there's a lot of brilliant thinking, I mean, outstanding thinking that takes place, within the profession. I used to turn up, particularly in the pandemic, to meetings. And if I was having a rough day, I didn't want to have meetings with certain people in the room, Mick included, because the thinking and the analysis and so forth is brilliant. I think that the unfortunate thing is that I just don't think the profession is realizing its potential, and probably doesn't understand the power that it really does have. I feel it's relatively new that this big focus on social justice and social change. Certainly, when I started as a board member, it wasn't. When I used to mention it, yeah, people could see with it, but I don't think it was being taken as something that was central to what the profession is all about. I think when we had the pandemic, when we had the murder of George Floyd, then the conversations really started to take place. And I remember having conversations with fellow leaders within BACP and stating that, if you're going to make this big announcement about social change, you have to really mean it, because I will take it as read that this is what we're going to do. And we'll get ourselves into problems because we'll raise expectations and not deliver. So, I felt there was a concern that, when you have these seminal moments like the pandemic, like George Floyd, and other things, a lot is said, promises are made, certain themes and issues are prioritized, but the further you move away from those seminal moments, the more likely that the profession, all professions, revert to type. And I feel that there's a level of that is taking place. We know that when there is recession, with the cost of living crisis, where these things happen historically, where those happen, there's an increasing racism, there's increasing oppression, and that's what we're seeing now, and that's manifesting itself in terms of people's experiences and psychological experiences and so forth. Is the profession fit for purpose as a system to deal with it? I want to say I don't know, but you asked me to be frank, I'd say no. Are there some individuals within? Are there some clusters within within the profession? Are there some good academic writing and leanings that are saying the right kind of thing? Yes, but I still have people saying to me, "Well, what's happening with the bursary program that we said we would set up, which would identify people from disadvantaged backgrounds, Black people and disabled people and others, and target them because there are issues about them joining the profession, be that finances, be that encouragement or whatever." But what's happening with that? What's happening with initiatives that are specific around the kind of training that's required so it meets the needs of that diverse society that we're trying to serve? What's happening in terms of that sort of thinking? And it's happening, but I don't know. Maybe I've been away for the last few months. I don't see it happening as cohesively as a system as I was closer to the seminal moments. Prior to that, it was Stephen Lawrence, and there'll be other ones. The economy 20, 30 years ago, recession. So yeah, if I'm being honest, I would say that a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah.
And I put myself as part of that. So it's not pointing the finger, because I was there for a while as well. So I look back and think, what could I have done differently? So I think there's a leadership piece here as well.
Well, and I resonate with you too. Like, we saw something that really fascinated and shocked us at online events. Like around the time of George Floyd's murder, there was loads of people coming to events, online events, who could easily do 2 hours, and maybe 300 or 400 colleagues would show up, and we were doing that most days of the week. And some colleagues said that they would do some training with us around diversity, around race. And we thought, well, this is the moment, there's so much interest in coming online, and of course there was so much need. We ran those workshops, and I don't know, we were getting maybe like 10% of the amount of colleagues coming to those workshops. It really surprised us, like how, like there's something in the profession where it's hard to engage, or we're not engaging. Like even at that time, at that kind of, we're right next to that seminal moment. And,
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think also people just become despondent. We've been here before, you
okay,
know. So,
okay,
you know, I remember during the lockdown um, having online meetings. I remember one particular online meeting and having it at my father's house, and he was in the background. My father was politically active in the 70s and 80s. And as I was talking, I sort of looked around at him and I thought, why is he putting that face?
mm,
And, you know, just carried on talking and meeting finished. I said, Dad, are you okay? And he just sort of said, are we still talking about this? It's like deja vu. We're saying
mm,
the same things and it's not happening. And I think there are a lot of people that are feeling that. They're engaging.
yeah,
But what is it that needs to be done to take these things
yeah,
forward? What is it that and I think this is something around leadership as a system
mm,
within the
mm,
profession.
yeah,
Um, and I think it's important to look in at what it is that um, therapy does and how it does it, different modalities and so forth. I think that's important. And how does that link to, if we're speaking about social change and social justice, how is it linked to what's going on out there now? You know,
yeah,
rising homelessness and people in the street, food banks. It's become a normality, gaslighting, the way that politicians are behaving, you know, and people's sense of despair, despondency. You know, I traveled over the last 3 months to a couple of other countries and so forth, and hear what people are saying about what's happening in the world, but also what's happening right here in UK. What's the psychological impact that is having? And so, yes, I think this. I always talk about seminal moments because I think things happen, people
yes,
coalesce around those. We need to do differently. We need to do better,
mm,
but it's not really happening in the way that we need it to happen. And that's why I think the piece around speaking about social change has to go hand in hand with speaking about how do we influence, how do we relate to what's happening politically. And the converse is true. And I do a lot of work in that leadership space with politicians, local level and at national level as well. And they get it. How do we bring the two together?
yes. Well, before we get into that, I want to maybe see if this is the right place for you, David. But like, did you then have a sense of the impact on clients, the impact on people who wanted to train as therapists, that the profession has really, I think if we're being really polite, struggled to engage, maybe even resisted engagement for a long, long time? Like the actual impact on people engaging with services.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, in different ways. So I think that if you speak about George Floyd and pandemic, there were certainly a lot of people that I spoke to or through organizations I'm involved with, where you're speaking to people about becoming a counselor and there's high interest. I want to do that. And in some ways, some of them were doing that unqualified but highly skilled in their communities, on their estates. Um, and But there were barriers to entry, I think, to the profession because some of the whatever is said on paper, some of the competencies that institutions are saying that are required to enter the profession in the way that they are articulated are ruling out certain people who are otherwise doing a grand job actually having therapeutic conversations within communities,
Mm,
within churches, within faith organizations. So I had a lot. During the pandemic, we had, I hosted, I think it was every 2 weeks, about 120 people from the black churches, ministers in the black churches, who were talking about the need for those kind of interventions, and how could we work with the profession to actually do this? And what about their therapeutic needs, having to bury people, every single week and not getting the kind of therapeutic support that they wanted? Great conversations, but then it wasn't happening. And I think, I have to hold myself as partly responsible, because I was one of those leaders within that system, and it didn't happen. And so we acted politically, in the sense that we said, we wrung our necks. Look, let this moment not pass us by, as it has done previously, the recession, Stephen Lawrence, and et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing happened. So it's an abrogation of responsibility on a collective level why this hasn't happened. So that,
Could you give an example of one of those kind of the way the criteria is shaped that's excluding? Could you?
Well, I think, yeah. So I have a very good barber, as you can tell, called Patrick, and I refer to him fairly often. And I go into barbershop, been going to barbershops over the years, and I sit there, and you'll hear people talking. So someone will say, you know what, there's this guy, and he's having this relationship, and the woman was unfaithful to him, and he's really depressed, and da, 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 da. And I'm thinking, and everybody knows you're speaking about yourself there. And Patrick would be great. So not just that example, other examples where he'd be having therapeutic conversations, and really useful and supportive ones. When George Floyd was off, I spoke to him and said, Patrick, you need to do this. And I spoke to a number of organizations about how they could engage with the profession and maybe get supported funding, other funders and so forth to do it. He was really, really, really enthused. And he made contact with one of the training institutions. And he says, David, you know what you said is just full of shit. He said, because actually they don't want people like me, because whatever's put on paper, actually what's being described is a white female, white male, able-bodied. That's what's being described. So I think there's something around, I think we've shifted in recognizing. I mean, I started out in social work. I did that as a result of the social work profession stating that we need to address the disparity in numbers of Black and Asian people coming into the profession, not just because it's a benevolent thing to do, but because, increasing number, disproportionate number of Black children in care, issues around, mental health and so forth. We need lived experience into it. It's business critical that we do it. I don't think we're as emphatic in describing it as anything much more than benevolent. We need to do this, or we've got the parlance around lived experience and so forth. But why is it so important? And why, Patrick, could you make a really outstanding difference? And I think that's writ large.
Yes. Yeah. Like he's
discrimination. So Patrick's not, he didn't, I was very fortunate, different reasons, but access to good quality education back in his time. There was O levels and CSEs, and the disproportion of Black people and some girls from working class areas did CSEs rather than O levels, which were not regarded as anything when you qualified and were going to move up. So there's a historical disadvantage in terms of education. There's a historical disadvantage in terms of where they fit in the poverty stakes, and what does that mean in practice. So I suppose I'm giving a lot of my own experiences, much of it based on my ethnicity. But I think if you're looking at, how do we make the profession more relatable to our diverse society, you're looking at a range of issues there. And I just feel that over the years, we speak about it much more coherently. We speak about it in the manner that it needs to be spoken about, because it's so important, but it doesn't manifest in terms of follow through and what that actually means in terms of training, in terms of practice.
Yeah.
Just my thoughts, right or wrong.
I think it's so helpful to hear it, David, and like for you to talk so honestly. And I kind of wonder, because when you're holding the office of president, there's so many things that you're having to take care of, as everyone who holds those leadership positions. But if you weren't restrained in that way, if you could kind of get the profession by the scruff of the neck almost and go, right, this is what we're going to do. I mean, there's no one thing, is there? But I wonder, like, I mean, you're saying something about how we describe the training and then how we do the training. It's not really
Yeah,
a question in that, David, but do you get a sense of what I mean?
yeah, I think so. I think there's still. I mean, you might have some views on this. I think this. I think there's still a lot of focus around what happens in the practice room between the counsellor and the individual um, client, which should take place because they're foremost there. Less about the circumstances that lead them into that room, and less understanding about why that is important in terms of that interface between the therapist and the client. So I, as president, spoke to a wide range of people because I think, in terms of my presidency, I wanted to be out there. Who would recall their experiences, either as practitioners or even as people that have been clients or are clients, who just say they just don't get it. Or at best, what I'm getting is something really powerful whilst I'm there, but it's not sustaining me. It's not sustainable because there's a lack of an insight in the system. And I think we can't talk about social impact, social change, and social justice. I think justice is an important part of this. Without part of training and maybe part of that commitment being around that. And, you know, I've spoken at many conferences where people said, well, look, my responsibility is to the client in that room. I think that's important. There'll be different people that will do other things outside of that room to different degrees. But I do feel there's got to be something around that understanding of what some of that backdrop might be, and how then that informs the approach of the therapist. I don't think there's enough of that. I think there's going to be more. There's much more of a need for that now. I think, you know, I've been doing this leadership thing for a long time, and, you know, every year we say we're living in unprecedented times. Everyone just nods because that's the thing that we say, and yeah, we are. But when you say it now, these are unprecedented times, unprecedented challenges. Politics, as we knew it and criticized it, when you look back at it, there were halcyon days compared to now. And what does that mean for individuals within communities that really, really need counselling? It means a hell of a lot. Are we fit for purpose as a system in terms of dealing with it? No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, it feels so important to be having this conversation, David, like, because it's so, I think it's so easy, and I include myself in this as a therapy field, to go, oh, well, what are we going to contribute to the political system, the social change system? And this conversation is so important. We need to be thinking about ourselves and getting ourselves fit for purpose. And yeah.
And that's where I think collaboration with communities is so important. Being highly qualified and skilled and trained as a counsellor, no one can do that piece better than the counsellor. So I'm not saying that communities and community organisations and so forth take over that role at all. But in the absence of really collaborating and really getting a sense of what is going on out there, I don't think the therapeutic intervention is well informed enough. And maybe there's something. I mean, I made a statement a few years ago where I said counselling is too important to be left to counsellors. What I meant by that, and what I elaborated, was to say that it is so important. It's so an important intervention that you need advocates, you need ambassadors that aren't counsellors. You need politicians that, when they're speaking about mental health and so forth, don't just talk about CBT. They're recognizing actually what is so important in terms of, creating a better future for society and the role of counselors and psychotherapists within that. And yeah, I think that that's not happened.
Yeah. Well, and giving all the frailties of the therapeutic world, counseling and psychotherapy, why do you still think it's so important for societal change? I mean, I'm not saying, yeah, well,
Yeah, because it gives hope, doesn't it? And we said not, I've been sort of victim of some of your questions. I've spoken about what's not working. Actually, there's a hell of a lot that works, and people see
yes,
it, and the
yeah,
stigma, I think is reduced considerably from the time I started working in this
yeah,
area to where it is now.
yeah,
And I have seen firsthand the benefits of it.
yeah,
I've felt it. Anyone that in the BACP world didn't know my mother died 2 years ago hasn't been listening. I talk about it every time, and the therapeutic support I received just in
yeah,
terms of dealing with that and the family. Um, and even members of my family that just instinctively, oh, I don't do that counselling thing. I don't know what they're talking about. It's that's it's not diminished. It's diminishing. It's decreasing. Um,
mm,
and in terms of the political space, when you're speaking about mental health, when you're speaking about resilience of communities, community engagement, and how do you work with communities and individuals within communities where there's no answer. You just got to sell hope because there's no money. Um,
yeah,
and what impact is that having on individuals? We've seen how therapy has supported people within that. So it's so important. And I think that we have an audience now where people don't do what they did maybe 20 years ago, just saying, well, what's that all about then? I think
yeah,
there's, at the
yeah,
very worst, most of the time, okay, let's hear this because,
yeah,
um, we, in communities, I do a lot of work with young working class people, young black men that are either involved in or at risk of serious youth violence and involved in some, you know, really challenging stuff, serious stuff, who, and you get them on their own and you speak to them, they know and they say they want support, but they're not getting it in a way that's culturally appropriate. And I use the word culturally appropriate across the board all of the time. The profession shouldn't depend on the the hundreds of brilliant individuals that there are. As a system, it needs to be doing what those individuals are doing. Shouldn't be the luck of the
yeah.
draw.
That's so powerful, David. So powerful. Well, and I appreciate you saying about your own experience of counselling around your mother's death as well, and like how helpful that's been, and how much the profession has to offer. And I'm being in that conversation about how do we close this gap? And I guess in a way like that, the therapist going, seeing the clients kind of going home, recovering, having a bit of a life, or like something about really being living in the cultures, living in all of our cultures, like absorbing all the cultures around us. Not, I think the more classical life of the therapist has been a kind of isolated life in a way. But are you kind of calling for us to kind of give up that and be all the way in with our communities? And
Yeah. I think things are just becoming more challenging across the board.
yeah,
So we can't
yeah,
play with this thing. Actually, bad interventions impact in the severest way on people's lives. Sometimes it's better to have no intervention at all. I'm just saying that in terms of what I've experienced, particularly as president, where some cases were brought to my attention. But every time I say that, I'd say conversely, there've been
yeah,
some, the converse has been true as well, which is
yeah,
why we have to keep making the point about why um, there are few panaceas to the problems of society. But if one was being discussed, counseling and psychotherapy would be part of that.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that definitely is the hope and aspiration of so many colleagues. I think that's why a lot of us get into the field, because we want to be part of that movement forward in the human evolution, then absolutely. And so important not to lose contact with that very sobering experience of interventions that would have been better not to have been made. They've been so profoundly unhelpful, like holding on to both ends of that spectrum, just really important. I wonder, and this might be too big of a jump, there might be some bits you want to fill in the in-between. But like you've been walking the corridors of power, I guess, in terms of the people that you work with, people at the grassroots of the political system, all the way through to people who are making decisions at the senior level. And I mean, the question that comes to mind for me, I'm sure there are many other things to get into, but like, what have you learned about how power works, how politics work, that we're disconnected from in the therapy field, that we kind of, like if we knew how it worked better, we could make a bigger contribution in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll say this. I think there are a lot of people in the profession that would know this, or they may even disagree with it. But I think that there's something about recognizing the power that counselling and psychotherapy has, and being able to communicate that better, and to use parlance that aligns itself to what will make politicians listen. So I think there's always something about getting a real understanding about what's happening in their world, what makes them tick, and what focuses their attention, and how do we communicate, how do we use language and terminology which will resonate, that they can relate to. So I think sometimes politicians are speaking to therapists, and therapists are speaking to politicians, and they may as well be speaking two different languages, which the other does not understand, but they're wanting to say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's something about what is making politicians tick. I mean, what I've experienced is, I think increasing despair, because people have lost trust in politicians. Um, um, People just don't believe politicians. You have really bad examples of politicians that will say something, and they know it's not true, but they'll still say it anyway, and that happens at President Trump levels. It's right the way through to what happens in local government and so forth. So I think there is that lack of trust. I think there is something about really speaking about the benefits that counselling and psychotherapy can have for their constituents and their residents. And where you've seen those counselling approaches, so within groups as well, within communities, and housing associations have done this as well with tenants, politicians begin to see the benefit and become advocates of it. So I think there is something around in the first place. I mean, I don't know, do meetings, we did it with BACP at times where meetings would take place, but we're discussing the issues. We're discussing the mental health bill. Yeah, we're discussing the particular issues and spending less time having conversations to get to know each other's terrain. So we're trying to focus on the deal rather than focus on the relationships. When you focus on the relationships, you build trust, and you begin to establish what's important in each other's terrain. And I think that's a bit missing, and where I've been able to bring that together, because I've been a real advocate of the work with elected councillors in England and Wales, which we're doing every other month or so, and council leaders and cabinets and so forth. They're speaking about these issues, and I've been able to have been privileged through the relationships I've built through the work that I did in the profession to bring those together. And it's amazing what takes place when those conversations take place, because you're able to focus in on what really matters for politicians, and more so what matters for their residents, and it helps them. If they're just being completely impersonal, if it's helping them their popularity in the vote, then that's what's happening, if we're frank about it. But they're getting an understanding also of the power of therapy, how it relates to issues around mental health is a big, massive deal. in all communities,
mm,
particularly
mm.
post-pandemic. So I think there's something about how do we stage more getting together, um, understanding around each other, and not just having conversations about the deal,
Yes.
mental bill changes and all that kind of stuff, but having conversations about each other's terrain, building the relationships, understanding how politics works.
Yeah. I mean, that should be music to our ears as therapists, building relationships. Like we go on and on about that, don't we? And
Yeah,
how easily we could then objectify someone else, maybe a politician, and just go straight to the issue without
yeah,
doing the kind of work we'd be doing with our clients, wanting to build that, get to know. And so, yeah,
yes, yeah.
so,
And I think
so
critically as well, in between election periods, because a lot of the interest both ways is there's election coming up, let's have a conversation around this. And in fact, it's the bit that happens in between. How do you build the relationships? How do we get a sense of, my mother always used to say, my therapy, my mother, she always used to say, if you can understand the other perspective and really understand it and be able to understand it even better than that person advocating it, and then learn their argument and argue against your perspective with their argument. I mean, I suppose what we're saying is if you can really, in a really deep way, just understand how politics works. And it's not rocket science and it's not exact, but I think there's something about just what is important to really address the issue of social change. You cannot ignore politics. And that's what we're speaking about, therapy and
mm,
social change. There has to be that bridge building, there has to be that
yeah,
understanding. And it can happen. And it doesn't take a lot
yeah.
for those conversations to take place.
Well, and would you have an example that comes to mind about maybe an imaginary politician and therapist having a conversation where really they're talking about the same thing, but their language is so
Yeah.
different, and maybe where a therapist might be able to
Yeah.
adjust the vocab,
So
the language. Yeah.
yeah. So people talk about knife crime quite a lot.
Mm,
Um, and there's that debate around knife crime, serious youth violence, criminal justice issues, and trauma on the other hand. And I've seen countless situations where things have been framed within a criminal justice paradigm, where politicians and therapists have got together and actually have recognized, actually, this is a scared little boy suffering from trauma here. There's some real challenges, um, lack of a father, poverty, mother's not around, mental health there. So how do we address this particular issue? And and to what extent, and to a great extent, therapy has been part of that solution. And
mm,
politicians begin to understand it, and communities begin to engage and say, actually, this is really important because we're being framed as criminals here, when actually there are underlying things that are going on. And if you're going to provide support, it's not through the prison, it's actually through therapy,
mm,
culturally appropriate therapy in a way that people, because a lot of those boys, we're talking about white working class boys and black boys, just not, we're not relating it. They can't relate. They can't relate to us coming in the room and scare the hell out of. And some of it might be a stereotype, but getting the politics together with the therapeutic world, there's something about how do we frame this, but more fundamentally, how do we address this fundamental social issue, societal
mm.
issue, and where does therapy fit in within that? So I think
Yeah.
that's I've seen that example and I've heard of that example time and time again.
That's so powerful. So powerful. Yeah. And is there a language that we might use as therapists around that just goes over? Oh, well, I don't mean over the head in terms of it just doesn't land, let's
Yeah.
say, in a politician. Because
Mm.
I think we then get into a language, we do the training, we talk to colleagues, we're in We start to not notice the water we're swimming
I
in.
think that's true. It's one of those things, isn't it? Because we're talking about therapy now. If you go into politics, they've got their language. You go into
They've got the
business, they've
yes,
got their language. My
yeah,
son's a lawyer. He's got, what the hell are you talking about? In
yeah.
fact, when I first started with the ACP, I spent the first 3 months as a vice president nodding and pretending to understand what the hell was going on, and just confessed and said, "Look, let's have a real conversation about this." And so
Right.
I think we all have to look at as as my mother used to say when I lived up north, say what you mean and mean what you say. Just
Yeah,
so thinking
yeah,
about how we communicate, and I think just having honest conversations. I think a lot of it gets lost in people feeling they need saying the right thing, whatever that is. So I think we need to create safe spaces, and that we're having the real conversations, because I think that's where the understanding comes from.
mm,
And I think in the academic and conceptual and theory space, looking at the importance of that, even there, I think that's really important, because that's where the learning and the qualifications and the leaders come from in that particular space as well. So I think that's important in that space as well.
yeah,
Not moving away from academic and intellectual rigor. That's important. But how do we bring that thinking into that space?
yeah. Like as we're training colleagues, that they can have that experience of tough conversations, real conversations, and yeah, yeah. And as we're coming up to the election, it's well, as you said, we're in very unprecedented times, and it can be easy for well, I think so many people are feeling like we're talking about this before we come on the recording, disillusioned, and like there's not much agency that we can have. We look at these global issues, maybe even issues locally. Like, as you think about your experience in the political circles, do you see that it is possible to actually affect change? As colleagues are maybe listening to this, go, right, okay, fine, but life just rolls on. We do the same things over and over. What's your experience, David, about being able to kind of nudge things forward? And
I think ultimately, if people aren't participating in the democratic process, they're not being listened to. So, whatever you're saying, if I'm a politician and it's come up to election time, and you're saying something really, really powerful, but you've decided you're not going to register to vote, why would I listen to you? I'm just being really stark. It's important, but actually it's about the vote. When we're in politicians, about the vote and being able to do something with bargaining power. So I think there's something about building that hope and people seeing the importance of engaging within the system and registering to vote, and because I think that feeling of powerlessness obviously has a massive impact psychologically. So I registered to vote. Well, what's the point in voting? Who do I vote for? There's been an increase over recent years, the number of people that have been despondent with the mainstream party political system, increasing independence, and independent alliances. So I think there is something around, and I'm just playing this out now, and I don't know, but there's something about how do we encourage through our interventions people to feel more hopeful, and to feel more hopeful because they can recognise that if they get involved in democratic engagement and participation, actually that's helping me to feel more hope. I can do something. I can take some kind of control of my life. So I think that feeling of hopelessness is something that both the politics and the profession could work on together. So a lot of the work that I do as chair of Operation Black Vote is around how do we encourage particularly the younger generation to get involved, because they're not getting involved, and these are individuals that are coming into the client rooms. So I think that is really, really important, and I think that social change. I cannot speak about social change unless we're speaking about hope, and how do people find themselves represented, how they engage, how they're participating, and what systems can be using to so do. Councils often talk about citizens' juries. I think it's happening actually, doing some work around citizens' juries, and I did that as a started off as president doing some work where the council actually hosted a conference um, um, around counselling and therapy and the importance of that. And citizens' juries, they've actually followed it on where there have been individuals who are clients, therapy clients, who got involved in that and have felt much more powerful and empowered as a result of feeling that they can make a difference in their local place, be that around potholes, be that like bin collection, be that around, neighbourhood policing or whatever. I think the more we sort of think about these issues and think about these examples, the more we can see actually that there is some correlation.
Yeah. And that's something we could be actively talking about in our communities, maybe even with our clients. Are we participating? Are we engaged? So encouraging each other to be engaged. And yeah. And you were saying earlier, in terms of that work, like the levels of voter registration are incredibly low in racialized and minoritized communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So only 25%, more than 4, of Black eligible voters are registered to vote. that's 25%, 24% of Asian eligible voters not registered to vote. In terms of those of mixed heritage, 31%. If you look in white working class areas, there's still figures coming out. The showing is not as low, but really alarming and concerning figures. So you have got that sense of powerlessness, and what's the point, and how does that then manifest in other areas of your life, and how does that inform then what happens, or what should we should be thinking about the client?
Yeah. Well, that increase in participation would have a massive impact on the politicians, I guess, and because, as you say, it's the vote that makes the difference. And yeah.
So when I was a political advisor, I'd speak about these particular issues and loss of empathy and so forth. But if they're going into particular areas, they're going to focus on those people that are registered to vote and actually can make a difference. But what we found is that sense of hope really increases when people feel that they're able just to speak about how they're feeling, but more importantly, get involved in some way. There'll be different levels of involvement, different levels of participation, different levels of understanding, but it's building that sort of psychological state.
And then there's a real positive cycle in that talking in therapy can create hope, maybe creates agency outside in the community. Being able to contribute creates more hope, come back into the therapy world, build that up some more. Like there could be a really positive circle in that.
And we found that those are happening in communities anyway, where it's been more difficult now because of the cuts. So there aren't as many community centres or youth centres. But where they are, these are the conversations they're having. There are therapeutic conversations taking place in churches, vigilaras, mosques. They're speaking about these. But often there are people involved in it that aren't qualified. Still doing a good job, not qualified if we're talking about an approach which is around, a society and as a profession, really being the best that we can be, to not be engaging there or learning from there is a real big mistake, big opportunity lost.
Yeah. Well, and here we are approaching a general election in the UK. Well, lots of countries are approaching elections around the world. Maybe do you have a sense of whether there's any particular political persuasions that might be more open to change? Or that's a tricky question, isn't it, to think about? Or do you see Or do you see across the political parties, like there are people in all the parties that are kind of willing to engage in these conversations? Or maybe
Yeah,
it's
I just think, we've got to have hope. But and I keep coming back to this, if we're talking about social change, then the challenge is, how do we engage those individuals? How do we work with people that are potential allies, honest opponents? How do you work with the fair weather friends? Because there are many of those in politics.
yes.
How do you work with adversaries? So I think it's just that political consciousness and awareness is part of our thinking, in engaging issues around social change and encouraging it the other way around as well.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really still thinking about what you said a little while ago about that it's, of course, everybody's in a frenzy as we come up to the election, but it's about building those relationships over the years, like long-term relationships really makes a difference. Yeah.
And focusing on, I call it the noble cause. What is it? Why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we doing this? Why is this so important?
Yeah.
What are the issues that we're trying to address? And I think that focus around the cause is so important, because people can coalesce around that. They may have different approaches, different views, different standpoints, but if a value, a principle or purpose around the profession is going to be around social change and social justice, which I think it should be somehow, then I think that's a great, I wouldn't say starting point because it started, but continuing point. People can coalesce around that. If anything goes, people aren't capturing why is this so important, and why is this so important now, then I think we'll be having these debates forever ad infinitum.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, we've covered so many and visited so many places, David. But I want to just check in with you if there's anything that you've been thinking about before the conversation that we haven't touched on, or there might be something very deliberate you would want to say to colleagues who tune into the podcast that we haven't, and there might not be, but I just want to make sure there's some space for that, David. And
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we've covered most of what I thought we would cover and wanted to cover. I think it's my last point, really. Just we speak about social change, social justice, just really thinking about what's happening now in society in the UK, what's happening internationally, what that means for the people, our clients, and why our understanding of that is so important in terms of shaping the kind of intervention that we have as therapists. I think that's really, really important, and creating a sense of urgency around it, because we've spoken about this for many, many years. But I do believe there's a sense of urgency that's required now, in really harnessing a leadership endeavor, a collective leadership endeavor to address these issues around social change and what it means for the profession. And I think from my point of view, and some may say, you might say this, I remember being asked, are you a black president or a president that happens to be black? I'd say both, actually. But my identity and my lived experience means that I give attention to those issues that impact on me and people like me, and it's impacting on society generally, which is around the issue of race equality. And I think where there was a time a few years ago where we were all talking about we must do better now in terms of race equality, and we're using parlance like anti-racism and what that means for the profession, we, just like many other professions, are speaking less about that now. And there's a level of reverting to type that we must challenge, especially now where racism is on the increase and where discrimination is on the increase, which always takes place at times of recession, massive cost of living, and diminishing hope in politicians. So I think our role is about social change and social justice, and that should inform what we do and how we do it, and further conversations around that. Or else this is just an academic conversation without any kind of outcome. And I think having these academic conversations, as long as they're outcomes focused or inform outcomes, I think they're great. If they're not, then it's just traumatic. So I will feel, and I often did, as, as president and in other settings, as you know, this is almost abusive now because we're just talking about this stuff and we have the ability to actually do something, and we're not, and we're all responsible for that. But we have more of a sort of moving away from I as leader to we as leaders, and that collaborative leadership piece within the sector and across sectors. I think we can make a difference.
Yeah.
So that's what I'd have to say. To thank
I
you very
really
much for inviting. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot to take away and think about, and that continuing to talk with that action is we're just re-traumatizing. Like, we need to be on the move, making a difference in that we position as leaders. So important. Yeah. David, I want to particularly say thank you for how frankly you have talked with us. I think that's just so important as a profession to really see ourselves as we are, and the distance that we need to cover. That's the only way we're going to be able to make that progress.
Yeah.
And thinking about how we get into dialogue with our colleagues in other professions, particularly the political profession. So thank you, David. I really.
That's fine. Thank you very much, John. And I see myself as part of that. So it's not that, it's us, we.
Yes.
What things could I do differently and better? And who else am I going to work with? What could I have done differently? Because our role really is to bequeath to the next generation society better than we found it. That's what my father's generation did. Actually, I want to say this, the Windrush generation. And we've been let down by successive governments in plain view. And people in my communities take that seriously. And it's having a traumatic impact on many members of our communities who are experiencing their parents, who've experienced their parents being, victimized and discriminated against in plain view, been sent back to the Caribbean and other parts of the world unlawfully, papers being lost, and then told that they'll be compensated, that not been compensated on the back of what many argue is a political business plan that says they're going to die out anyway. So, I say all of that not to sort of say it's all doom and disaster, because we have to have hope and there's some good things happening. But it just shows you, doesn't it, that, in a few years' time, you're going to have people from my communities and you're going to have people from other communities that are suffering significantly and really need the kind of interventions that only this profession can do. But we've got to really be clear about why, the big why we're doing this. What is it we need to do, and create a sense of urgency to deliver this. So I want to say thank you very much for inviting me. I hope there's been some food for thought, and keep up the good work. It's great, brilliant.
So much food for thought, so much. And we need to hold all this together as a whole community, don't we? And also being in receipt of the wisdom from your parents too, really appreciated that. And thinking about our community responsibility and how much needs to change. We're really at that inflection point where we can make a difference. Yeah. David, thank you so much. It feels like that's the moment for us to finish. So really appreciate this more than an hour together. And thank you for everything that you brought to the conversation. All that, so much food for thought, David. Thank you.